You studying? My name is Joshua Hancock, and this is for my research project for the spring 2022 semester of PSYC 379. So my project was entitled The Relationship Between Emotional Intelligence and Emotional Eating Unpacked. The background for the project is we had to choose the two variables, our psychopathology construct and our personality construct. And for psychopathology construct, I chose emotional eating, which is the behavior of eating-related patterns independent of felt hunger and commonly associated as a regulation of coping with different emotions. And the personality construct was emotional intelligence, which refers to non-cognitive abilities associated with interpersonal accommodation dealing with emotions through things such as being aware of emotions and identifying them and being able to call them out and manipulating emotions as well. My hypotheses for this research project was I hypothesized that emotional intelligence would be negatively correlated with rates of emotional eating. And for my empirical rationale, I stated that my hypothesis is influenced by the results of previous research that found that emotional eating is positively associated with lower rates of emotional intelligence and vice versa, as negatively associated with higher rates of emotional intelligence. For my empirical rationale, it showed that the literature reviews showed such an association taking place in prior studies. For this first example was direct verbiage related of emotional eating as negatively associated with emotional intelligence. And then the second one had a similar findings with different names, but similar in characteristic, with appropriate eating being negatively associated with emotional regulation. For my theoretical rationale, I utilized psychodynamic theory, as it's a psychological theory that emphasizes the influence of feelings and emotions on human behavior and how this might be connected to early experience. I utilized more so the former half of the definition for this research project, as the personality variable of emotional intelligence entails an ability to become conscious and regulate emotional phenomena. Since emotional eating is generally considered as a male-adapted behavior and part of the symptomology for diagnosable eating disorders, I hypothesized that emotional intelligence is negatively correlated with emotional eating. And given the psychodynamic theoretical approach, it shows that connection between thoughts and feelings and then behaviors. And on to here. This was the participants for the study, which was among my cohort of students for the spring 2022 PSYC 379 course. And from the age, most of the participants were between 20 and 21. And then for sex, most of the participants were female and most were non-Hispanic Latino. For racial categories, most were white at 48%, with all other racial categories falling below that. And then years in school, most of the participants were juniors at the undergraduate level. Now we're moving down to here. This was some of the what we used to measure social, personal, and emotional intelligence was a scale utilized to measure emotional intelligence, and it came from the IPIP-VIA item scale, which listed each of the 24 characteristics range falling between the social, personal, and emotional intelligence, and measuring them all. For the sake of this project, we focus on emotional intelligence. And under the emotional intelligence scale, there is 10 plus questions to be answered by participants, including I am very aware of my own surrounding, which is an example of one. For the sake of this project, we utilized the first 10. And the questions were assessed by participants on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being very accurate and 5 being very inaccurate. Or actually the reverse, 1 being very inaccurate and 5 being very accurate. And from the results that we've seen with the study, the internal consistency here was a 0.68, which is considered as a weaker internal consistency, which might have implications for the results down the road. And with the histogram here, you can see that the mean was a 2.1 for the scores of the scale, and the median was a 0.28, which was interesting to notice that difference, where the standard deviation fell between 0.62, and then on to the next set of measures. I think I skipped. We'll go back here. So that was for the personality scale. And up here was for the psychopathology scale. Now for this one, emotional eating scale was utilized, and the TENS emotional eating scale is self-reported, which consisted of 25 line items, and for this case as well, only the first 10 were used for the project. And that measures a person's eating desire when experiencing various emotions, including resentful, irritated, and blue, as taken from the scale itself. These desires are rated by participants using a 5-point scale again, just like down here, with 1 being no desire to eat and 5 being an overwhelming urge to eat. So there's images here of how the questions look, with saying, when I experience resentment, what are my eating levels feeling like from that 1 to 5 range? And the internal consistency here was differed from the personality scale, where it was a 0.8, which is considered as a good or a solid sort of internal consistency. Now with these two measures in mind, we move on to the results of the study. The results of the study are descriptive, show here with the scatter plot that we had a Pearson correlation of 0.023 and a Spearman with a p-value of 0.86, which is considered higher, and a Spearman correlation of 0.034 with a p-value of 0.79, which is considered higher for the p-values. But for the Pearson and the Spearman correlation themselves, there was a little difference, but both of them were still statistically insignificant, showing really not much of any sort of correlation observed. And as summarized and stated here, was that no statistically significant correlation was represented through the study. The weak correlation that did manifest was also positively correlated, which differed in contrast to the original hypothesis of a sort of negative correlation. And reasons why this could be was, as mentioned before, there was that observation of this lower internal consistency in the personality measure. And that could be a result of different limitations that I mentioned here, which included the way that measurements were collected, which is as part of all the different variables of personality and psychopathology variables seen. And this whole process took over 2 hours in length for students, and if done in one sitting, it could have resulted in participants that grew tired and were not the most attentive or focused when doing the scales themselves, which could have manifested into these results of a statistical sort of insignificance. But these, I had references mentioned here, but that is the whole project for my research project looking at the relationship between emotional intelligence and emotional eating. Thank you.